Very nice, Peter.
Hello and welcome. You might know me as Enclave from the Fallout Equestria reviews, and I had an idea. So every time we do the Fallout Equestria reviews, we have this portion of the show in which we go into the story and we often discuss the do's and don'ts of writing, especially when it comes to Fallout. But when me and Afterglow discuss it, it's mainly for Fallout. Um, and I wanted to make it more general now. Again, this is more leaning towards Pony, but if you want to use this also for like your other stuff, then by all means go for it. So general stuff regarding Pony, whatever you want to choose, it's up to you. I am joined with my co-host Smutty.
Hello.
Hello and
It's
welcome.
it's good to be back. I am so sorry for kind of ditching you with the whole Fallout Equestria thing, but I'm sorry that was just that was too bad. I couldn't take it anymore. It was like torture.
Yeah, I want to hear your 2 cents before we dive into the overview video of this. Like, what was like, the main like top three things? Like, you don't have to go into it too much, but like, what were like the top three things that you just didn't enjoy about the story?
I didn't enjoy about it.
Yeah, you didn't.
Okay, I didn't. Well, first, Little Pip, the sole effect that she went out to this horrific world just because she was lusting after a Pacific mayor. Um, Two, there's like a lot of inconsistent like writing things where it tells you one thing, but then it immediately forgets said thing like a few paragraphs later. That just makes you like scratch your head and wonder when's that gonna, be returning and coming back. Spoiler alert, never. And three is I don't enjoy these kind of like worlds where one character makes all of the important decisions while basically everyone else is just a prop basically. But that's just me.
Okay. So you basically didn't like the call of action or
Mm.
conflict rather for Little Pip, and then the style of writing was poor, which me and Afterglow do agree on. There's a lot of parts with like what you just said where they mention this thing at the beginning of the chapter and then it just gets forgotten. Towards the
Yeah.
middle or even at the end, or all of a sudden, hey, this thing that happened way back in chapter 3, we're going to talk about it now in chapter 13. It's like, oh, okay, you know. And then the last thing too, I think a lot of people agree with that. They don't really like it when just one character makes all these like big decisions and the world changes. Not to say that that hasn't happened in real life, but you know, other people do appreciate better writing when there are multiple characters making multiple decisions that affect this faction, that group, this country, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Am I hitting right in the ballpark there?
Yes, you are.
Okay, cool. I was just
You're hit,
interested. I was just interested
you
on why you
you
left.
you're hitting right in the stallion's ball right now. Correct.
Okay. So this is a pilot, right? This is just something that we want to throw out there and see if we can garner some interest. We know that there are a few of you guys out there that are interested because we get comments on the FOE video. Looking at you, Wub, that you're always giving us insight because you're working on your own story. And I'm sure there's a few other people too. It's just they're not brave enough as you to actually express their ideas. So you're already doing a lot better compared to those other people. Not to say the other ones aren't doing anything. It's just that those that are brave enough to put their words onto paper or onto the screen are, leagues ahead. We'll use that word instead. The
Wub.
series,
Wub.
Wub.
That's their name.
Yeah, his name's Wub. I call him Wub for short, but his full name, if I can just pull it up over here, is oh, you're gonna love it. This is why I didn't say the name right away because I know you're the biggest fan of this individual. Name is Wubway.
Wubway. What the I'm sorry. Wubway.
It's not the Wubway you know. It's just
Okay.
it's just I know there are certain reserved thoughts of the Wubway that the fandom knows, and that's why I think my brain blocked out saying the whole name because you would have not believed me. But this is a totally different Wubway.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, they have two separate accounts, but they comment on the Wubway account. They read stories, and as always, we put their links of their work and stuff like that because I enjoy listening to Project Horizons on the job. It is a
Right.
very long story, and I know you may not like Vanilla Fallout, but where Vanilla Fallout like failed in some parts, Project Horizons did better. But this is not a Fallout Equestria review. Let's move on.
Okay.
So, you want to create a story, right? And these are the most simple, bare bones stuff that you are going to encounter when you're going to write or create your story. Now, are things going to be one to one when it comes to art and just using words? Not really. But
Right.
the general idea is still there. If there are any artists out there that want to give us your 2 cents in the comment section or want to join us on the show, by all means, you know where to find me.
Right.
So let's get right into it. We
Right.
have setting,
Mm-hmm.
characters, conflict, point of view, style, and tone.
Right.
That's pretty much the basics, right? Because you're more of a writer than I am. Let's be honest here. You've actually put stuff out there and you
Yes.
practice. Is that the
Well, well,
basics?
well, not. I wouldn't say put stuff out there because that would imply I have like a few like published titles, which I don't. They're
Oh,
all.
you share it
I got.
amongst our circles. I will say that at
Yeah.
least.
Yeah. I
But
have like three unfinished stories, but I have run a few greens. Yes.
oh yeah, that's a disclaimer right there, right off the bat. I have only written a handful of greens, a short story or two, and I'm still continuing on my own project over here. So that's my experience. I'm a decent storyteller from what people have told me in the sense of like podcasts and stuff, but I'm not really sure if that's going to translate one to one, when it comes to writing. So that's just kind of my background, and you just mentioned your background. Um, so yeah, um, let's get right into it. And before we do that, I just asked you, those subjects, is that like the basic bare bones stuff, or would you like to add or take away anything?
Those are the very basic bare bones. Obviously, a more advanced writer would probably pick out something a little bit more nuanced, if you will, if that's the proper description. But those are the basics, yeah.
Okay, okay. So here we go. Setting, right?
Uh,
And again, this is just an overview. Each of these subjects are going to get their own video, and if we missed anything and you guys want to add to the comments, by all means, go for it. I will be more than willing to look into it. But these are just the big ones, the big five for right now that are definitely going to get their own video. We're going to put a lot more work into it because I have some stuff that I want to add to it, whether examples of other franchises or other stories, and just, artwork in general. Uh, Going right back into it. Setting, right? When we think about setting, we think about the time in which the story takes place. You know, we think about it in a sense of like, is it taking place in the past, in the present, or in the future, right?
all
And
right.
if you have anything to say, just let me know.
All right.
So I don't cut you off or anything like that.
Mm,
Um, History, right? History also ties into this kind of stuff. What events led up to the current state of affairs?
right.
Whether you're doing in the past anything, I hate to do this, but is anything past that, things that happened in the past, before that even occurred to lead up into it. If you're in the present, go into some of the stuff that happened in the past, and then again in the future, are there, choices that the main character or other side characters are making in order for like things to be put into place and for the story to continue going. Um,
Right.
then we have culture and environment. You know,
Yes.
are these characters, are they coming from the same area, the same city, that maybe even the same neighborhood, or is this, individual, let's say from, you know, Ponyville, they are going all the way to Canterlot, but on the way onto that, endpoint, they meet other individuals from other areas that they do things differently. Even though, let's say they are, Pony one for one,
Right.
they might be doing things a bit differently compared to those that are in Ponyville or other, settlements that are close to Ponyville that might be even similar to their culture, but they do things differently here and there. And then we mentioned environment. You know, when we talk about environment and how it affects a group of individuals, we're gonna have, let's say, throwing out the example right here. I know you love mod, right? I know you love mod, and
Yes.
I love Applejack. You know, um, but in my
Wait, you
head,
like Jack?
well, I'm just using it as an example.
I never knew you were Asian. Jeez, what a new discovery.
That's an inside joke.
Yes.
Um, well, at least from what they all told me, they said they really like Applejack because she's a very hard worker. And I'm like, yeah, I can see why. I can see why. It has nothing to do with the physical traits, but it's legitimately because of like the hard work ethic and honesty,
Right.
the brutally honest stuff. But I know where you're coming from. So yes, Applejack and Maud. When I think about them, they're both Earth ponies, right? However,
Right.
in my mind, I think of Maud being far more sturdier and stockier compared to
Yes.
Applejack, only because Applejack's a farmer. Not to say that farmer girls ain't tough, but I think a miner girl, the one that is always in the mines, dealing with a bunch of metal ores, you know, um, and that kind of stuff, that kind of environment is going to be probably a lot more tougher compared to a farmer chick.
Especially historically, I mean, miners, like Jesus, like being a miner, like was especially back then, it was just a dangerous job. You were not expected to like live long whatsoever. So yeah,
Yeah, you might get like, black lung or just like the collapsing of the tunnels and this and that. So it's not fun. So I would think that that would breed a more like hardier type of group, compared to, let's say, the farmer ponies. And it's the same thing.
not, I'm sorry, but not to mention, like I remember one thing I learned about miners that they basically invented pit fighting because whenever they had some time off, they couldn't leave the mine. So what they would do is they would dig like little holes, like two holes that that two people can sit in, like stand in, they can sink in a bit, and then they would just punch each other until they found out like who would get knocked out first. And that's how they would like spend their downtime basically. So that just tells you how rough it was down there usually.
Hmm, that the more you know. I mean, it does
Yeah,
tie in with the word pit fighting because
yeah,
they're literally in the pit. All
yeah.
right. No, that's cool. And that will tie in too with the culture.
Basically, yeah.
There's a reason why these ponies are so stocky, rugged, tough. You know, why is this area over here they're more militaristic compared to over here where they're more into trade and agriculture, or these
Right.
other ones are nomads, this or that. Like, there's so much you can do that yes, you can use the show and other materials as like a base for it, but you know, have your mind go free. Use your imagination. Use real world stuff too. No one's the no fun allowed people. Ignore those people. Use enrolled references. If you want to have Germanic ponies, go for it. You want to have Russian ponies, go for it. You want to have
Right.
Japanese ponies, go for it. Add those outside world influences. And again, it doesn't have to be the common era stuff either. You don't have to, at the time of this recording, 2024. No, you can go back X amount of years and use specific time periods and use that. So that's basically the general of setting. Is there anything else you want to add before we move on to characters?
I just want to say, if you want to, just a little personal tidbit. I feel like the nationality that would like the group that would most fit like a German culture would definitely be unicorns, 100%.
Hmm. I was thinking of French because of snobbiness, but they could be like a subcategory there.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I remember one of my past ideas was that in like a more like I don't know, like grounded, historically based Equestria, you would have stuff like the unicorns having like vaguely like German last names, not because like it's like not because like their culture, but they want to sound snobbier, so they just pick these very German sounding names, which is historically based on America in like the first half of the 20th century, while they were like really trying to adopt French culture.
Hmm. Yeah, no, it also could tie into just the personalities of the ponies or other characters you want to do, griffins, zebras, whatever. You know, it helps too with character creation, and it'll tie more into that. But you can take names very literally. A very common German last name, at least over there. I don't really know about over here in the States, but at least over there in Germany is Weiss. And you
Right.
can correct me if I'm wrong, but Weiss, like it's a similar translation to like snow, right?
Right.
Like
Yeah.
white snow or something like that. So, you know, you can have your pony, if you want to go on the nose, they can have a white coat, you know,
Right. Yeah.
or a gray with a gray mane. It's just stuff that like kind of you see like more, with the snow. So it's just kind of like if you want more on the nose, then go for it. One thing I would add before we move on to characters when it comes to setting is to make sure that you have two very, very important things, and we'll probably, again, when we go into the detailed video, I want to talk about this a lot, is a timeline for it. I'm not talking about an outline, but I'm talking about a timeline of your story.
Right.
Does this story take place within 3 months, 3 weeks, 3 days, maybe even
Right.
3 hours? You know,
Yeah.
have a timeline you're following. Because if you're doing a story in which there's a lot of traveling happening and time does matter when you're traveling, especially for those that played the original Fallout 1 and Fallout 2. Time matters. So make sure you stick to your timeline. And then the other thing that I was going to say when it comes to setting is have rules for your world and please follow the rules. If just putting it out there, if the unicorns are the only ones that are able to do magic and this and that, and like that's just the main staple of your story, that they're all very exclusive and they don't want to interact with the other pony groups and this and that because they're the only magic users, yet all of a sudden you have earth ponies and pegasi that are also using magic, you broke the rule, you know
Right.
so just
Basically.
keep that in mind. Again, go into more detail when we get into the actual video.
Also, I just want to point out for the time thing is, you don't have to like explicitly say, "Ooh, this amount of time has passed." You don't have to say, "Ooh, it's been 6 days, it's been a month, it's been 2 months, it's been a year, etc., etc." You can express time has passed just by writing details. Like, for example, if we had a stallion and he was making a very long journey, you could write in the very first chapter, if you will, that he has like a very clean cut, and then like 5 chapters later you can say how he's now scratching like a formed beard, stuff like that, basically.
He's rugged.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. No, and I'll add on to that before I move on. I know I said this like 3 times already, but even like the seasons, you can
Yeah,
say, oh, we started our journey, you know, back in the winter, and now, you know, the trees are starting to gain leaves again. It's a spring now. Just
yeah,
having those like little words instead of like what you said directly saying, oh yeah, it's been like a week. It makes the writing process fun. It also makes the art fun too because you can draw a couple panels of them traveling. Let's say during the fall, you're seeing all the leaves and everything's falling to change the color, etc. And then on the next page, it's snow or rain or whatever. So just play with those ideas. Now officially moving on to characters. So characters, this is probably like the most fun you're gonna have in a story, at least in my opinion. You're gonna simply create them. What they look like, what traits they have, you know, what values they hold. Who are they? That's basically the question you're gonna ask. Who are they both inside and out? Their goals, their fears, their interests, and their relationships with others. Um, yeah, that's what I got here. This is the most fun I think you're gonna have, especially for those that love to create characters. If you
right.
have other people you can talk to, you can bounce off ideas. We mentioned it before, and we'll probably have a totally different series for this one. But we have a friend over there, Gorbox, is interested in doing character creations, explaining the color theory, so more on the artistic side. But we can also probably add a little bit of tips and stuff where their physical traits can translate into some of their personality stuff, you know?
Right.
So if and again, you can have fun with it. An example being you have a very large mare in the sense like she's stocky, strong, you know, heart of gold though. right? You think when you see her, you're like, oh my gosh, she's huge, she's gonna beat me up. Yet she is the nicest and kindest mare you're ever gonna meet. She
Right.
doesn't want to hurt anyone. Unless you put a hoof on her or a hoof on her friend, then you better kiss that hoof goodbye. But that's her character, and that's what makes it interesting. While you have another one, right? Where very bright colors and this and that, yet they have a very depressing mood all the time.
Right.
So you can create these paradoxes and things of that nature. But those are
Exactly.
just some ideas that I'm throwing out there. Go for it.
Like that, it could be that, or it could be a colorful character who's incredibly toxic, vile, etc. That's another way you can do the whole, nice exterior, horrible interior, that sort of thing.
Mm, the classic, the beautiful is actually the ugly trope.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and we'll more than likely go down all these like common tropes. There's nothing wrong with using them, but it's often fun to mix and match them and try to look at things in a different perspective. So you can
Right.
always fall back on the old reliable, but we want to have fun with this.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right. Anything else you want to add?
No, I don't think so. I think you've covered it beautifully enough.
Okay. Oh, just keep your characters consistent. That's what I'm gonna say
Yeah,
too.
exactly. And if you're using like already established characters, not original characters, you need to keep them in character. And if you want them to drastically like act differently to what they're usually portrayed as, there has to be a good logical reason for it. It has to be, written well and directed well, if you will.
Mm, I will have to agree with that. There has to be a event that leads up to it, whether tragic or traumatic, but there has to be something that leads well-established characters to go off their path. I don't like stories where all of a sudden one day they're all sunshine and rainbows, the next day they have a bunch of corpses in their basement. It's like what do we miss here? You know?
Right.
And don't get me wrong, you can have fun with it. They saw something happen in front of them, and all of a sudden something ticked. But if you build up to it, that'd be great. They can have this moment where they were deathly afraid of bugs and this and that, yet when they crushed one, they felt something different. So they went and they kept finding ones to crush, 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 and eventually they started moving on to, different animals and then eventually other ponies. And oh my god, this sounds terrible, so I'm going to move on to conflict.
Yeah, that's a good idea. You need to write that down, actually. That's a good Grimdark idea. I'm not gonna lie with you.
uh, if you want to take it, go for it, man. But I'm just like thinking about it. I'm like, oh my god, what am I using that for an example?
We can
Um,
call I can just call it just Stomp or something. Just something
yeah,
very simple.
yeah, something very like just for shock value or this or that. But
Yeah.
yeah, just do that, and you can do the vice versa of that too. You can have a character that didn't care about anything in the world or whatever, but then all of a sudden, you know, one of the mares just showed a bit of kindness, and all of a sudden, like, oh, that felt pretty good. Let me continue doing something productive then, and I'll get more validation, and then that develops into something else, and then it turns into a little love story, and all of a sudden you got a bunch of like little, fillies and colts running around because you met your wife. I don't know. Just
Or the
play with it.
alternative, you could do it in a way of where they're not used to that sort of affection, so they become quickly obsessed with that person, and that innocent relationship soon turns into this toxic thing that kind of leads them down the path of self-destruction, if you will. If you want to do a more psychological, deconstruction of the whole romance trope, if you will.
That sounds pretty good too.
Yeah.
We'll definitely go into detail about this. I like these ideas. All right. So, we're moving on to conflict, right? Conflict is very self-explanatory. You have your internal issues and your external issues. So, the problems that the character themselves are dealing with, whether if it's like things from their, childhood that they're still dealing with, or, some type of event that they partook in that still bothers them, or they wish they could have done something, different. Not has to be something tragic, like, oh my gosh, I lost my parents and this and that. Like, no, it could have been something simple of like, wow, I didn't apply myself as much, so I'm stuck in a crappy job and I work as a dishwasher the whole time, and
Right.
you can make it a comedy. So it's just doesn't have to be the end of the world type of thing, but you got to play with those kind of ideas. And again, if you're going to be doing something more realistic, keep it grounded. If you want to fly towards the sky, then by all means, throw pasta against the wall and see what sticks. Um,
Exactly.
you mentioned this earlier, and this is very important, is that the choices characters make, they should always have consequences, whether positive or negative. I
Yeah.
firmly believe in consequences as well. You know,
Right.
um, and keep it consistent. If you're gonna spend half a chapter talking about a choice that this character has to make, and they make said choice, and it has a consequence, again, either positive or negative, please run with it for a little bit. Don't just like, oh, we made our decision and it's done. I'm not saying that there are situations like that, because there are, but if you're gonna put so much into it, please write more about it. I'm tired of like this build up. The thing happens and then it's just not mentioned ever again.
I feel like what you should do for the very, very drastic decisions, you should try to have an outline of how you want this to affect the later plot, if you will. Obviously, there's going to be smaller choices that don't really matter too much, but for your very big ones, that kind of shake up the story and it's going to change it up for the rest of the duration of it, you should have a little outline of how you want this to go, if you will.
Yes, and I think that should just be a general rule of all types of writing, as well as just creating comics or manga, or even animations or something. Have an outline, and I think that will be its own like little subcategory of like the basics of this type of stuff, is also just having an outline, like what you said. If you have this idea of a character making decisions, then write like a type of butterfly effect type of thing. Make sure you
Right.
have your ideas ironed out, and if you don't like the sound of something, then there's no shame of taking it out. Or you know you can always have other problems that maybe may have not fit the character that you're writing about, but a side character maybe. You know, it's
Right.
really up to you. Um, but yeah, the conflicts and stuff like that. Uh, I'm not saying every single decision should matter. I'm not saying as soon as this character wakes up, the day is ruined because they decided to drink chocolate milk instead of regular milk. Like, no, unless they're writing a funny story, they're lactose intolerant for whatever reason they forgot, and they are just having a freaking awful day. They were supposed to have a date, but they were late because they were hugging the toilet. Then yeah, fine, whatever. But
Or one of those situations where they've had like several bad things happen to them already, and in most cases, this little minor inconvenience wouldn't bother them. But for this, occasion, since they've already had like 10 different issues, this is like the break-in straw, if you will. Then in
hmm
that case, it's gonna work.
yeah, and again, these are just ideas. Play with them.
Right.
Um, But yeah, that's pretty much what I have for conflict. I mean, it kind of ties into like timelines and stuff. So all of
Right.
these kind of bleed into each other if you really think about it.
Mhm.
Um, we're gonna move on to point of view.
All right.
So point of view is basically how the main character, your vehicle that you're using, views the world.
Right.
This is harder for me to explain only because it's like, doesn't this have to do with just, conflict and also just characteristics? But I
Right.
guess from, well, what I was looking at was that it's just perspective. If you decide to just focus on the main character only, then you're going to be seeing the world from their eyes. But if you do those stories in which, okay, here is character, um, you know, peanut butter over here, but Cookie has a couple chapters in which you see the world from her eyes. But
Right.
but also Marshmallow over here, you're going to see the world from her eyes. So if you're going to be jumping from this and that, then perspective is very important. And I think you can have fun with that because sometimes the way the main character views the world isn't how another character would view the world. And I think that's where you have fun with this part. But
Right.
if you want to add anything to that, because I mean, for me, I still have to like learn more about it for more than I can talk about. But that's just like the gist of what I understood.
Well, for bigger stories, yeah, the whole having like different chapters for different point of view characters is very common, but it should be noted that for those, you don't have to have every single like main character have a point of view. To give an example, to those who are autistic enough to be into A Song of Ice and Fire, there is like several like main characters that never get a point of view chapter, and all the details we know about them are from other characters describing them. And this is very interesting because we don't get like the internal thoughts of the character. We only get assumptions and like kind of very, very vague ideas of what they're thinking in their heads, which makes for, better analyzation, stuff like that, more intrigue, if you will. So sometimes you don't need to have a deep, like, in look in the character. You can just have another character describe them to you, and that can be often more interesting. Just depends on how you write it, really.
Yeah, no, and I agree. I agree. Bigger stories, it works. Of course, for comics, it's definitely a really good tool you can use for comics because that's a bit more easier in the sense of like switching point of views. For writing, I mean, maybe you'll probably have a better time handling that than I can explain it, but I know for writing it's a bit more difficult because you kind of have to change the style of writing in order to fit that character.
Right.
So we'll move on unless you have anything else to mention.
Also, I think like point of view like really just depends on the genre of story you're making. There's some genres where, first person point of view, you're only following one character is better. And for those, I would mostly say stuff like psychological stuff, maybe a story where someone is deteriorating, like getting bad mentally and they're, about to have their breaking point, etc., etc. But for more grand stories, it might be better to have like a third person point of view where you can, more equally know the eternal thoughts of said characters, stuff like that.
Okay. No, I see what you're coming from, and I guess an example could be the one that's on the top of my head because I often listen to a lot of like crime and even horror stories and this and that is like let's say like the perspective of the victim,
Right.
like maybe the detective, police officer, or just you know um, an individual that's just trying to get like into it, trying to solve this mystery or whatever. They stumble upon just something that the victim left behind. So you do use that as like switching, and that's more obvious, so it's a bit easier. So if you want to practice, maybe do those type of stories. But yeah, that's pretty good, I think, for now.
Hmm.
We'll move on to style and tone. So it's also straightforward in the sense of like these are like gonna be the features that make your story, your story. This
Right.
is also probably maybe I often look at it as like the second or third most fun thing that I personally like to do is because this is what's gonna separate your story from others. And I'm not saying like, oh, I'm gonna take all of these like really good things from all these other stories that I've seen and I've read and all that, but you can add your own unique twist to it. You know, this is gonna be the part where your style of writing is either going to be, as mentioned before when we were talking about a little bit about setting and also just the other things, but I think using the example of the environment, right, are going to be very straightforward. Are you going to say like, oh, is a cold night out there? Or are you going to provide like imagery to your word? Oh, every time I stepped out, I felt the frost, against my coat. I couldn't even, take a step forward because the snow was all the way, up to my, what, knee? I don't know.
Right.
Just trying to, I'm trying to remember anatomy. It's harder for thinking in a pony perspective rather than a human. But use more imagery, you know?
Right.
So it's just kind of like that's that kind of the stuff that people are going to do. And then, I mean, lastly is the part, of course, that's also just more straightforward. Is it a horror story? Is it a sci-fi story? Is it grim dark? Is it psychological horror? Is it action? Is it adventure? Is it comedy? Is it love? Is it romance? You know, some
Right.
subjects are vastly more easier to write about than others. Not to say that it's easy to write a great horror story, but it's easier to experience horror from watching a scary movie or this or that than it is, let's say, love, because love is a very different experience that I think personally you have to experience in order to have a good grasp on it.
My
Um,
80% of the fandom has not probably experienced, but that's a different story.
Jokes. Um, but yeah, kind of what you said. Like it's just it's super obvious when someone that's never experienced certain things, like again, romance or action or even sometimes even horror, try to write something like that, and you can tell it's like, okay, I know what you were trying to do. I can kind of see the vision, but this ain't Chief, you know?
Right. Yeah.
So that's kind of like some of the main stuff I think for that. Is there anything you want to add?
Well, for horror, it really like okay, let me dial this back a little bit. Like, obviously, there is different styles for horror. There's different styles for any genre you're working with, and for each of those like genres, like your story kind of has to be formed differently. Like for example, for horror and I don't know, I'm gonna mention this, but for smut, clop fic, stuff like that, horror and clop fics, I feel like that requires the most details, like heavy, intense details, to be appealing. Because without details for those two genres, like a clop fic, a horror fic without much details will just fall apart immediately.
Mm,
So, so you kind of have to realize that some genres require something more specifically.
I could play devil's advocate when it comes to horror in general. I
Yeah,
know
well, yeah.
there's.
I mean, yeah, for the unknown, like obviously
Hmm.
I love that, but I'm talking more like general, your more violent ones, stuff like that.
Ah, okay. You're more leaning towards like the Goru or like shock.
Yeah,
Um,
but-
okay. Yeah, no, then that's their own category. I don't really dive into it that much over there, but I respect the writing when I do notice details that I'm like, wow, I have painted an image in my mind because the way you wrote it, and that is horrifying.
yeah.
um, but yeah, no, you're right. You're right. When it comes to those certain genres, there's always going to be different skills, different techniques. Are there any final thoughts you have on style and tone before we wrap it up?
Well, I guess another thing for style and tone is that if you're doing first person, any like extra details you give will mainly be a character trait because it's the character telling the story. If you're doing something like a third person, then that can be more of the offer of the writer or whatever, given their own little tidbit, and that can either be something like of compassion, so maybe like a nice writer telling his little story, or you can be like this horrible, like horrid, like crypt keeper type writer, giving some like nasty like quip or whatever about someone getting killed, stuff like that.
Hmm.
It really depends. And I've seen like all of that for especially horror. I've seen like a lot of like writers like add these like little like nasty like details with, if you will, with like third person style stuff.
Okay. Yeah, and I'm sure once we get to the actual topic, I'd be more than willing to talk in more detail about this stuff and bring up the examples that I mentioned beforehand and all that. And, just to wrap it all up, I mean, that's kind of where you start, though, when it comes to writing a story or
Yeah.
your own comic or that, is to see other things that interest you and just tell yourself, I want to do something similar to that.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with borrowing ideas, right? What's wrong is when you steal them. If you do a one to one, you know, just an
Sure.
example, you played the entirety of the Combat Evolved game, and you decide I want to write a fanfic based off of Combat Evolved, but all the characters are just simply ponies now. That's not a story. That's not a fanfic. That's just you rewriting everything, but just they're all ponies now. You know?
You're describing like 40% of the fix in like 2010 to 2014 era.
Yeah,
From
and that's the interesting thing, which we have mentioned before. Again, if you want to hear that more in detail, please go watch the Fallout Equestria reviews. But just to give you a little bit of a taste of that, we said that when it comes to a lot of these moments in the story in the chapter where it's like, oh my god, this is basically this mission, but we just switched everything to pony instead. It's literally this Fallout New Vegas mission, but they're ponies now. It's literally the Fallout 3 mission, but it's just, it's very obvious for those that actually played the game and went through with it than just those that read the fanfic because it was popular at the time and were like, wow, this is impressive. Again, no big shade towards FOE in general. It's just, had it been written, let's say 4 years ago compared to way back when, 2012, 20, like that era, right? It probably wouldn't have been as popular.
Yeah.
So, I'm just throwing those ideas out there for those that are interested in like writing. You know, if you like something, then by all means brainstorm. Don't have one to one. I mean, yes, there's probably gonna be moments where it's gonna be like one to one. Maybe there are certain, areas or vehicles or everyday objects and stuff like that. Yeah, that's fine. But you know, when it comes to names or plot points or this or that, that's where it kind of gets a little iffy. So back to what I was saying, um, just dive into it. Those that want to write, those that want to draw or create in general, just start. No one's telling you to stop. No one's telling you this or that, unless it's something really messed up and illegal. Then yes, don't do it. But when it comes to the overall like creative process, like just have fun with it. Have fun with it. That's basically 90% of it is like having fun with it and making sure it works and all that, and then everything else is just basically making sure your grammar is correct, spelling's good, and all that other stuff. Even though I probably made a bunch of grammatical errors while recording this, but that's speaking and writing is very different. Um, and yeah, I mean, try to do something that others haven't really tapped into. Maybe you read a fan fiction, a standalone thing that gave you an idea. You know, you can use that maybe. So it's a it's going to be a journey. It's going to be a path, and you're going to see what works. You're going to see what doesn't work, and if you need to, find your own support group. That's another tip I would say. Find your own support group. Have those couple friends. Look at your stuff, read your stuff, because trust me, I know what it feels like to post something and no one even looked at it. And it's not because of the whole like validation thing, but it's more of, okay, is it a good story? Did I write this? Did I draw this pretty good? Like, those answers don't get questioned unless somebody saw it. I'm not expecting, a literal Who to drop a 1.5 million word story and then have people like read through it. I'm sorry, I had to be realistic here too. But
Yeah.
if you start off with a short story, let's say, I don't know, what sounds decent, 5,000 to 10,000 words for a short
Right.
story,
Mm.
that's a lot more doable compared to, hey guys, this is a fanfic that I've been working on for 4.5 years. Here you go, and it's like a 1.8 million word like colossus. It's like whoa,
Yeah.
whoa, you know. So it's really hard for me, just using as an example, it's really hard for me to uh, listen slash read through Project Horizons, and that's a very popular story on that side of the fandom, you know. Um, but that's because it's Project Horizons. It's well known, and of course I'm going to give it more of a chance than, you know, Notebook 575 just made his new story that has, more than 1 point something million words. It's like, okay, so be realistic. I know it sounds like I'm being a little doomer here, but it's just you also have to just look at things realistically. And then art wise, uh, believe me, there are so many different styles. There are so many different tools you can use. Don't give up on that art stuff. Even if you are drawing stick mares, let's say you're doing stick mares, there's something unique about that. You know,
Yes.
do it. Doesn't have to look like Shino's art. Doesn't have to look like Anandi Anon or all these big time artists. If you're
Well,
literally
hey, I mean, if you're like posting more than like once every 5 months, you're already kind of a bit better than Shino.
oh well, shots fired. But
Yeah.
yeah, you know, people are gonna notice, and these little things again that are different, they also get more attention, you know. So, any other closing remarks you got? Because I'm pretty much done. I've been yapping too much.
I think that's about everything.
All right. So, this is, like I said, just an overview, a pilot. Um, we love to hear your feedback on this, and we'll move on to the next subject. Give us about like a week and a half or so. And that, yeah, that's pretty much it. See y'all in the next one.